So before moving up here to live off grid, I was trying to calculate our electricity consumption, and it's really quite difficult. We had one of those smart meters which does show you how much electricity you use, but it doesn't update till the end of the day, sometimes the day after. Sometimes it gives you a breakup within the hours, but you have to try and remember what you plugged on. It's rare that you use an item for a whole hour, what else was plugged on in that time. And without running around with the individual plug power meter to check every appliance and then calculating it manually, it was quite difficult to figure out how much electricity we actually needed. So now that we've been living here for a whole year and our inverter displays how much we're pulling at each time, I thought it might be quite a good video to make to show you how to calculate how much electricity you need, or if not how to calculate it, at least how much do we use, what's our base power consumption, what's our battery capacity, how often do we charge it, all that kind of stuff, just to try and help you in case you wanted to do the same kind of thing. And you'd see what appliances we have here. We've also had a couple of questions of people asking. One guy asked me for an exact breakdown of everything we have. So I'm trying to make that video here so that you've got the information. Maybe it'll help you if you're going to go off grid yourself. I'm going to try and make all the numbers quite simple in this. So if I say 200 watts, it could be 180, it could be 220. I'll show you the exact numbers if we've plugged it in, but if I'm referring to something, I'm going to try and make the numbers simple so that the maths are easy rather than complicating it with exact numbers. If I say 200 pounds, it's going to be a rough 200 pounds. I'm not going for an exact breakdown of this. It's just close enough so that you're going to get an idea of what kind of things you might need to consider. When I talk about watts, I'm going to be talking about the power usage of items, so how many watts these use. And when I talk about charge, I'm talking about the charge of our batteries, which is what provides the power for your appliances to run, okay? So let's run over the basics of power. So if you know this kind of stuff, just give me a few minutes just to run through this for those that don't. It won't take me long. So we really care about watts when we're talking about power usage, because that's what the batteries are measured in. They're measured in kilowatt hours, which is watts. So although these have volts and current as well, it's the watts that you really want to pay attention to. And if you need to calculate the watts of most of the, I mean, this one here says on the front 1250 watts, this one says 2400 watts, so it does most of the time say it. But if you have an appliance that doesn't say it, you can calculate it, and the formula, which I've swapped around a bit, is watts equals amps times voltage. Okay, so watts equals current times voltage, and you can spin that around if you want different, if you want the formulas to work in a different way. So that means that we know we've got 240 volts here in the UK. So if you know the current draw in amps of any of the items, you just multiply that by the volts, and that means you get your watts. So as I've said before, it's the watts that we care about. Watts over time is the watt hour, and then if you multiply that up to a larger unit, it's kilowatt hour, which is 1,000 watts. 1 kilowatt hour is 1,000 watts over 1 hour. Okay, that's how it's calculated, and we're going to be working in that format from now on. Okay, so watts over time is watt hours, and we're going to be using, you can also have amp hours. We're not going to be going into that in this. Okay, it's a battery charge capacity volume. We're going to be going over kilowatt hours because that's what our batteries are measured in. We'll go over a couple of examples because I think if I was a little unsure before I figured it all out, so we're going to go through it just so it makes sense. So if you had 2,000 watts, let's pretend this is 2,000 watts. If you run that for 1 hour, that's going to be 2 kilowatt hours of power that has used. Okay, so 2,000 watts over an hour, 2 kilowatt hours. Okay, if this used 1,000 watts and you ran it for 1 hour, that's going to be 1 kilowatt hour. If you just use 2,000 because it seems like slightly more, the numbers might make a bit more sense. So 2,000 watts, you run that for half an hour, that uses 1 kilowatt hour. Okay, if this uses 200 watts, so lower power, 200 watts, and you use it for 1 hour, that's 0.2 of a kilowatt hour. And this is, I think, is how perhaps watt hours come in handy if you're using smaller numbers, but we're just going to keep it to kilowatt hours so that we're using the same unit. Okay, so that's why that's 0.2 kilowatt hours. Let's do a slightly more complicated example. If you have a hairdryer, let's pretend this is a hairdryer, you probably use it as a hairdryer, and let's say it uses 1,000 watts, so 1,000 watt hairdryer, but you're not going to use it for an hour, are you? You're going to use this to make the maths easy, let's say you're going to use it for 6 minutes. Okay, so it's 1,000 watts. You turn it on, dry your hair, and use it for 6 minutes continuously. Let's say you don't turn it on and off. So it's 1,000 watts. We know that 1,000 watts over 1 hour is 1 kilowatt hour, and you're using this for 6 minutes, 10% of an hour, isn't it? So 6 minutes, because it's 60 minutes an hour, it's 10%. You're using this for 10% of the 1 hour, which means this is using 100 watts or 0.1 kilowatt hours. Okay, and it can get quite complicated the more in depth you go to that kind of stuff. So that's 1 kilowatt. Use it for 6 minutes. It uses 0.1 of a kilowatt hour. Okay, so that's the basics done. We're going to go and have a look at our base power draw. So what kind of watts are we pulling all the time with our base, our normal appliances on, the stuff that you have to have running all the time. And we're going to work our way back up. We're going to turn some of these on and see how much they use, how long they run for, try and calculate that. We're going to go through some of the extra items that you might turn on throughout the day and how much power they use. We're going to do some frequently asked questions towards the end, which hopefully should try and clear up any of the extra bits you might be wondering. So yeah, let's go on a journey of our power consumption. Okay, so our base power draw is about 200 watts. It drops as low as 150 watts and it goes up to about 250 watts. I'm going to explain why that is later. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off all of the outgoing power and we're going to work our way back up. So you're going to have to bear with me whilst we're in the dark. And I'm going to turn off, there we go. We've turned off all of the power. And we're currently drawing 32 watts. So this is why I wanted to pull this. Off. I would show you this screen, but it's really difficult to show you in. It's all a bit blurry, so I'll try my best. But because of the focus, it just doesn't really show. So we've got 32 watts coming out now. Now, why that's important is because this, the inverter, actually pulls power. Okay, so this is pulling 32 watts at the minute, which means that of our base power, let's turn the power back on so you can see me a bit better. It means that of our base power, 30 watts of that is actually the inverter itself running. I think this inverter is actually quite a high power draw inverter. I've heard that other inverters don't pull quite that much power, but it's certainly worth considering. While we're here, we're just going to mention our battery pack is a 10 kilowatt hour battery. Okay, so it just makes it nice and easy. We've got two batteries and they're 10 kilowatt hours, so that's what we're using for our storage. Our base, very base, without running anything else, is 30 watts. So our 10 kilowatt battery, taking into account our 200 watt base load, will last for 50 hours. So using the same maths that we used before, 200 watts is 0.2 kilowatt hours. We've got 10 kilowatt hours, so that's 50 hours of continual runtime before the batteries run to zero, assuming that there's no variability in the power and we're not charging the batteries at all. So 200 watts, 10 kilowatt hour battery, 50 hours. Right, so what makes up our base power draw? We have 2 fridges, a small fish tank, our Wi-Fi equipment, which is 2 routers, and then our main router, which is up the hill as well. We have a water pump, which isn't really on most of the time, so that one probably doesn't count, but we do have a water sterilizer, UV sterilizer, which is running continuously. And then we've said already our inverter base power. So I think we're pretty typical. We run 2 fridges, which is, probably counts for somebody else who has an extra freezer. So yeah, that's actually, I thought that was a lot better than I expected before I came up here. So 200 watts, and we run all of that continuously, and then we have our TVs and stuff on standby as well, which will draw a tiny bit of power, but not much. So the things you have to be a bit careful of are items that are going to need to maintain a pressure or a temperature, because what they do is they might be on, but they're not pulling the same power draw all of the time. Fridges, for example, if they're maintaining a temperature, when they're at that temperature, they might be operating within our base power draw because they're not needing to do any active cooling, they're just kind of maintaining the temperature. But when you open a door or the temperature drops a little bit, it needs to pull more power to bring that temperature back down to where it's supposed to be. So our base power draw can go up to about 350 watts, because the fridges are trying to maintain their temperature. You've also got things like the power for the pump, that when you turn it on, it's trying to maintain a pressure of 5 bar through our water system, which means whenever it detects that's dropped because we've turned something on or flush the loo, it has to then pull power, and that varies depending on how much it's going to have to push through to supply either the washing machine or supply, you know, the refilling the toilet or running the tap. So those things are quite hard to calculate because they are always, you know, on, off, and all over the place. So we'll go over exactly the power draw they use slightly later on in the video, but just be careful of things that you plug in that appear to not be pulling any power, but they fluctuate throughout the day. Right, we're going to start with some examples. I'm not going to run this for too long because it's going to get quite complicated quite quickly. As soon as you start running around and turning things on, everything starts to get a bit of a mess. So we're going to do a quick example here with some lights. Lights is one of the things you actually don't need to worry too much about. As long as you've got LEDs, as long as you don't leave them all on all day, you're going to be okay. So lights, don't really worry about, because they're not really bad. But as an example, we have 360 watts at the minute. We're going to turn on 2 workshop lights. And that's gone up to 430 watts. So that's about, what, 80 watts, something like that. It fluctuates a little bit as all the items change a bit, which is why we're not going to go into too much detail, because it is quite difficult to measure. But as an example, turn on a couple of lights, and these are quite powerful ones. Yeah, so there's about 80 watts for two lights in there, and the light fittings above me are slightly different wattage. So lights of all of the electricity items are really those that you don't need to worry too much about. Let's go and turn a tap on, and we'll see how much our electric water pump uses. Right, so you've seen me turn it on, you've seen what kind of pressure we've got. I'm actually going to read this off the front of the water pump because it tells us how much electricity it's using all the time, which is really handy. Okay, so we're using 0.43. I don't know if you can see that, but that's using 0.4 kilowatt hours of power. So it's running at 400 watts, I suspect, which you don't run taps for long, do you? But that if you're running a shower and you're having that for about half an hour and you're at full pressure, you can end up using quite a bit of power doing that. So yeah, the water is one of them. So I'm going to put the washing machine on, and something you need to consider with washing machines is that not only does it run with the electricity to turn the actual washing machine, it also needs to use the heater element inside, which means the temperature is going to affect how much electricity it uses. But it also needs to run the water pump to get the water in the first place. So washing machines can be quite a lot of electricity, and tumble drying can be a lot of electricity because you have to get it quite hot. So washing machines are something that you're going to have to factor in, and it varies so much, so this is quite hard to go over exactly. But we're going to put one on, we're going to see what kind of numbers that uses. And we are going to start to test some other stuff, I think, because this is getting a bit difficult when you turn things on in the actual house. We're going to use some of the items we put on the table earlier just to give examples of how long it takes to boil a kettle, how much electricity that actually takes, and that's going to be a bit easier to demonstrate, I think. Got to be quick with this kind of stuff, because as I've said, if the fridge decides to start cooling itself down whilst we're doing this, all the numbers change. So we've got 332 watts showing at the minute. We've got the wash on here. It's going to run for 2 hours, 39 minutes, 40 degrees, 1600 RPM spin, no tumble dry. Press start. Now I'm going to show you what it displays on the screen, but really it's not going to start heating the water immediately. It's not going to start the spin immediately. So the power really fluctuates. So later I'm going to show you how much we generate or how much we use in a day, which should be a little bit easier to perhaps understand what our total consumption is. But this is just an idea of how much things draw. So right now it's gone up to 750. I just pop up to 800. So that's about how much it's running at the minute. But I think I can just hear the water pump running. So, washing machines are quite difficult to calculate. So to make it simple, we're going to look at the app and we're going to see how much electricity we use in a whole day. And typically we do a wash every day. I know you could get a little plug, I know you could plug it into the wall, and I know you could measure the power draw over the time. But it even varies depending on what kind of wash you're doing. So I'm just trying to make this as simple as I can. Okay, so hopefully you can tell that that gets quite complicated quite quickly to try and track exactly how much electricity you're using that way, because of how variable everything is. So I do have one of these power monitors. It just tells you how many watts and how many amps and things it's pulling, and it also has a kilowatt hour function. So we'll test a few of these appliances and just show you exactly how much electricity each one uses, and then once we've finished all that, I'll just show you how much our total energy is per day. We'll probably try and average that out if we can find the numbers, because that's really what matters. I've shown you we live a fairly normal life here, and if you live a similar lifestyle to this and you don't have any wildly different appliances that you're running many more times a day, you'll be able to kind of get a good sense of what an average electricity usage is. If you use our type of, if you live our type of life, which isn't that unusual. So we'll start with the kettle, because everybody's going to use this. It's a thing you might do several times a day, and it's going to be, if you were calculating your own energy requirements, I think you'd probably start with the kettle, because it's something everybody has. So it's putting 2,500 watts. While this is boiling, I'm just going to show you a little trick that we do with the kettle, because this is a really useful tip. A lot of you know it, but we boil the kettle, a full kettle, and we maybe boil it 3 times a day. But if you're boiling for cups of tea, you're going to be wasting a lot of energy, because if you could boil exactly the right amount of water for your cup, it would probably be okay. But the chances of doing that are slim. So what we do is we boil the kettle, we fill this guy up, which is the thermos, and then we use this for our tea throughout the day, which just means that the energy is kept to a minimum, because we boil the whole kettle, we store the heat in here. A little bit of it's lost, but it's good enough for cups of tea. Probably not sterilising bottles. I do that straight from the kettle, but it just means that our energy is a little bit less, because we're effectively storing it, and it just means that all of the heat is in here rather than some being left in the kettle after you've boiled it for a cup of tea. So that's what we do, and it does seem to make a fair difference, because the kettle, is one of the high electricity items that you'll be using in the house, as it can tell from here, because it's the same as our very high powered electric heater. So it's nearly done now. So just for for interest, it's pulling 11 amps. So if we wanted to multiply, we wanted to get the answer as how many watts this does, we'll go 11 times 220 volts, which gives us 2,420, which is actually very close, not exact. We've got 2,453 here, but if you needed to calculate it that way, you could. So far, well, I'll tell you when it's finished, because there's no point to so far, is there, on kilowatt hours? But this is a 1.5 litre kettle, and I've overfilled it by a tiny bit. So it's a full kettle, and we've used 0.152 kilowatt hours. So every time you boil a kettle, 0.152 kilowatt hours. So, if it only used 0.1, we'd have 10. Let me just check that. So if you wanted to run this, if you wanted to use 1 kilowatt worth of power, you can boil this 6.57 times, or 65.7 times if you wanted to just run the kettle. If you're using the whole battery power, you can get 65 boils from that battery pack. So it's quite a lot, isn't it? You're not going to be doing any more than perhaps 4, maybe 5 if you drink a lot of tea a day. So there's that. Let's try and test something else. So I did actually go and find a real hairdryer. So let's plug this in. We're on watts at the minute, and I don't know how well you can hear me over that. It's on low heat, so it's got 3 heat settings. Low heat is pulling 350 watts. Medium heat, 620 watts. High heat, 1,000 watts, so 1 kilowatt. high heat, high speed, 1.6 kilowatts, 1.7 kilowatts. So this is quite a high powered unit. We've been running it now for 50 seconds. I'm going to turn it back down to low heat and low power, because I think you want to, add long hair, you don't want to burn your hair, you're going to want to have it on the lower heat. So we'll leave this going for a couple of minutes. The voltage, although we're on a 220 volt system, it does vary. So this is 229.5 volts and it's 3 amps. I think 6 minutes was a bit generous when I said it earlier about using a hairdryer. I've run it for 3 minutes and we've used 0.02 kilowatt hours. So it's not really very much, is it? I don't have anything in there that I can blend right now, so we're gonna skip the blender because I don't want to go damaging it too much. Right, let's move over to the power tools. So this one's going to be interesting because it claims on it 1250 watts. So is that really the case? Let's have a go. Right, so we ran that for 5 minutes because that felt like a fairly decent Hoover. I'm not sure if this, it was bragging about the power, so it might be a fairly powerful Hoover. I'm not sure how yours compares, but it wasn't actually 1250 watts, it was 1000 watts. And the reason I put my hand over there was just to see if it under load, it suddenly increased, because I wasn't sure if it's claiming 1250 watts and if it's working harder it increases, but that just seems to be a 1 kilowatt. So if you Hoover with a 1250 watt Hoover for 5 minutes, you're going to be using 0.08 kilowatt hours. Right, so if you want to be charging a workshop battery, this one is a 40 volt, 2.5 amp hour battery. It's currently pulling 240 watts. So it's going to depend on how long the battery wants to charge. It could be any amount of time depending on the state of charge and temperature and things. So we're just going to leave it at 240 watts. Kilowatt hours are going to vary so much, so we'll just use that as the example from there. We'll give the grinder a quick go, see what that does. Hopefully you can see how power really varies, because some devices like that battery charger take a while to creep up to their power consumption. I'm imagining this grinder, when you turn it on, is just going to go, like it's just going to grind, because it's more of a simple device. So that's 1.4 amps and it's only about 150 watts. So I actually expected that to be far. No, 300 watts. 300 watts, but I still expected that to be higher than that. So you can see how variable all of the pieces, all your electricity is. So a quick word about heating, because this is something that I didn't quite, you probably know it, but until you're really using these things, it's not perhaps that obvious. But when you're using electric heaters, you've got 2 different kinds. Well, maybe there's more than 2 different kinds, but there's 2 main kinds. There's a kind like this, which has a heating element in there, and when you turn it on, the fan blows across the heating element and it puts out heat. You have this, which is an oil-filled radiator, which, although it's full of oil, is electrically heated. Now when you plug an electric fan heater like this in, the resistance wire, this probably isn't a resistance wire, it seems like a slightly larger element, but it heats up the element and blows a fan over it to push out heat, but it does that continuously. So if you plug this in, it's 2.4 kilowatts, 2,400 watts, and when you plug it in, it draws that power continuously until either you turn it off or it hits some kind of temperature limit inside, as in it overheats and it stops. When you're using this or something with an internal thermostat, what it does is it uses the electricity to heat the oil, and then it turns off, leaves the oil to cool down a little bit until it hits some kind of temperature limit which you set here, or maybe there's some also internal regulation going on, and then it turns the element back on, which means that when you turn this on initially, it's going to take a large amount of power. And that, I think I'll turn it on now, we'll see what it actually draws. These are easier to calculate because, like you say, it says on the front 2.4 kilowatt. That's the power that it provides in heating. This one, when you turn it on, I've got it on full at the minute, full power, all three elements, and it's putting out 1,848 watts. But this can drop all the way down to a couple of hundred watts when it's got up to temperature. So you'll have a high initial electricity demand, but then as it heats up, it cools down, which means these are probably a much better solution if you're trying to heat areas, because it doesn't just constantly drain the battery. But this is good. I think it puts out more heat. So when you're heating something with electricity, it's the same as far as efficiency goes, because you're using electricity to heat. So as far as the heat output goes, they're probably not identical, but basically you're turning electricity into heat. So this one would be doing it a lot faster. This one stores it in the oil, so it's not necessarily more efficient or less efficient. It just uses the electricity in a slightly different way. You tend to find that these heat things up a bit quicker, but then when you turn it off, there's no heat. This heats it a bit slower, but the oil will give out a residual heat over time because it's still hot. Like, you can turn it off and it's still hot, and then it cools down. It's got to come back on again. So there's a difference between the two ways you do it. This I prefer for heating rooms. This is good for rapidly heating rooms or for dumping power, which is what this is actually for. This is our dump load heater. So I had to just go and check the voltage that I was quoting, because I was saying 220 volts and I was like, hang on a minute. Is everything on 220 volts? And in my research, it seemed that the UK used to be on 240 volts. Then we dropped it to 230 volts to comply with appliances that are 220 volts. So it seems to be that it is a bit of a range between 220 volts and 240 volts, but we might be going a bit too in depth for this video. So let's just assume that, say, 230 volts, just keep your numbers consistent with your calculations. Don't vary the voltage too much. And then it might just mean that your end calculations are going to be a bit simpler, because you know, it's going to vary anyway. You're not going to go for an exact number when you're trying to calculate your usage, because you might leave it on for a minute longer or a minute less. You know, in real life, it's not quite as cut and dry, which I think is why it's quite difficult to actually calculate what you're going to use before you actually use it. But let's use our last example, which was the heater, to do this manually with a calculator, just in case you don't have a device that tells you the kilowatt hour. So we know that the wattage was 1,848 watts. 1,848 watts is 1.8 kilowatt hour. Kilowatts. Kilowatts is just kilo, 1,000. It's just changing the number from 1,000 to 1. You know, it just makes it easier to work with 1 kilowatt than 1,000 watts, I think. So we've got 1.848 kilowatts. And let's say we use that for, we're going to try and keep these maths nice and easy. So let's say we're going to use that for a quarter of an hour. So that's 1/4. So 1,848 watts over 1 hour. We know that's going to be 1.8 kilowatt hours. Times that by 0.25, because it's 15 minutes, which is 1/4 of 1 hour. And we come out with 462 watts, which is 0.462 kilowatt hours. It gets kind of complicated, but once you get your head past the watts over hours, kilowatt hours, it's actually just the wattage. If you run it for a whole hour, you just divide it by the time period. So that heater running at a quarter of an hour is going to use you 0.46 kilowatt hours. Now, none of this is really very useful, is it, until we have a look at our actual consumption. So I think most of these have just been examples if you're going to go around and try and test specific appliances because you've got something unusual that perhaps you want to just check, oh, could I run those hydroponic lights for 12 hours a day? If I want to be off grid, and you want to test that. So this is how you test it. We're going to run through the app now, which shows you how much electricity we actually use every day. So those numbers might be a better guide for you because they're real world. They're how much everything is used with the fluctuations of the power as we've had a look. And from those numbers, perhaps you're going to be able to just refer to that as a good daily amount to aim for. So having a look at the app now, and I'm filming it so you can see what's actually going on the screen here, but we've got different things at the top of the chart. Tells us the load, the export charge, PV import, discharge. Now I made the mistake of looking at the discharge initially, which is the discharge of the battery, but as we mentioned earlier, we've set the inverter up to use some of the power rather than just charging the battery all the time. So it's actually the load that we want to look at. For reference, when we were there at our previous place, which was on grid, and we had electric cookers and stuff, we were looking at about 20 kilowatt hours a day. That's what we would use. Varies slightly, but I think between 15 and 20 was what we were using at the previous place. And looking here, it seems like we are around that same number, just without the electric cooking, because we have gas cooking here because the caravan's got gas, so we use that for now. We've got days here which is 6.4 kilowatt hours. I think that was probably an unusual day, we might have been out for quite a lot of it. This one we've got 13 kilowatt hours in the day, we've got 12 kilowatt hours in the day, 11 kilowatt hours in the day. Got a day here that's got 20 kilowatt hours. Now that may well have been a day where we had a lot of power coming in, and I just decided to dump load a lot of it, because that will be recorded on here how much we are loading, and when I dump load I turn one of the heaters on somewhere, so that could be why that was quite high. This one's 11, 20, 18, 13, 15. I'll average that out when I edit this up and I'll show you what the average is, but I reckon that's going to be somewhere around 12, 13 kilowatt hours a day. So like I said, we live a pretty normal life here. We have some extra items that we use. We have a big TV that my son watches in the evenings. I have a big powerful PC that we use for editing, and I run that for a couple of hours a day. We have a 3D printer that we run. We have all the power tools. So we do have extras that we use, and that seems to be our average daily consumption. So that hopefully makes a lot more sense than us plugging in all the individual devices to calculate what they are, because I didn't do it, because the reality of running around your house and plugging in every single device, you're like, well, what if I missed one item that would use a lot of power? Am I really going to unplug the washing machine to plug that in to check every type of cycle that we do? So hopefully that number is going to be useful for you, and I think we will nip over now to some frequently asked questions and to conclude the video. Will I have to sacrifice all my electrical equipment to live off-grid? This was something I wondered. Am I going to have to downgrade the PC? Am I going to have to stop using power tools? Can I use a welder? All that kind of stuff. No. We still use everything we had before. We have changed very little as far as what we had. We haven't had to sell anything because it's too power hungry. We were already fairly power efficient, so we had LED lights and stuff like that. So no, unless you've got an unusual power requirement for something specialist like hydroponics, or perhaps you run your computer all day doing high powered computer simulation. Running a PC all day is fine, by the way. Then no, you don't have to sacrifice any of your electrical equipment to live off grid. Can I run power tools? Absolutely. But things like welders that require a large amount of power draw, you just might have to be a bit careful that you've got the specification for your inverter to and your batteries to do that. But yeah, absolutely. I haven't yet come across a problem with any of the power tools. We have table saws, we have all of the hand tools. Quite a few of them are battery operated, which certainly helps. But I haven't had to not use any of my power tools because we're off grid. Can I turn everything on at once? No, you can't. The capacity for your inverter and the battery discharge amps are things you have to be careful of. So our inverter has 8.8 kilowatts. This is the SunSync 8.8 kilowatts. So you can turn stuff on up to 8.8 kilowatts worth of power. You also have to check the amperage and stuff, just make sure that all works out. But no, you can't turn everything on at once. We can turn kettles on, heaters on, and the washing machine on, but when we've got that amount of electricity running through the system, we have to then be careful if we put anything else through. And if we do put anything else through, it just trips the circuit. So no, you can't turn everything on at once, but we don't find ourselves too limited. You don't have to like panic every time you turn the kettle on or something. You just have to be careful if you're running lots of high powered equipment. We can run the 2.5 kilowatt heater, and we can boil the kettle, and then if you do anything else silly like turn any other high powered thing on, like another heater, that will trip the power. So that's about how much we've got. But you can get bigger inverters if that's an issue for you, so you can. It's just with our capacity right now, you can't turn everything on at once. Can I charge an electric car? Yeah, you absolutely can, and this is one of our considerations actually, because we have more power than we need, and we thought about getting an electric car so that we can put the excess power into charging an electric car, therefore having free driving. We've decided not to, because I think running old diesel or petrol cars just feels more in keeping with what we're aiming to do. Electric cars dropping in value and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to get into it here. But yes, you absolutely can. You just can't supercharge. So you can charge an electric car in a normal 240 volt wall plug, or you get one of the chargers that you can put on the wall, but you're going to have to be mindful of how much power you can pull. So you can slow charge an electric car, but if your inverter isn't up to providing enough power to charge a car at the faster rates, you know, higher power, then no, you can't. So yes, you can, but you can't do it as fast as you might do. However, you'd probably find you don't need to, because if you're charging at a slow rate overnight anyway, and you're not using your car all the time for commuting and stuff, then yes, you can, but sort of. Could I cook with an electric hob and oven? Yes, you absolutely can. If I haven't got over this already, we had an electric oven and an electric hob before. My wife cooks all of her food, or our food, from raw ingredients, so she does you know, a big cook. She doesn't just reheat things. And it uses 1.5 kilowatts, 1.5 kilowatt hour per meal. So for dinner, it's a 1.5 kilowatt hour cost. Okay, does that make sense? So if you've got 10 kilowatt hour battery, it's 1.5 kilowatts of that charge, which is going to be used for a main meal for a family of 3. So using the hobs, using both ovens, probably 4 or 5 hobs, you know, she uses the whole lot. 1.5 kilowatt with electricity. So as long as you've got enough power, yes, you can. Do I always drain my batteries? So is all of the power that you're using draining your batteries? No, it's not, because you can set your inverter to use the power first, which means if you've got some power coming in from your solar, you can set your inverter to either prioritize charging the batteries, or you can prioritize the load, which means that if you say boil your kettle takes 2 kilowatts and you've got 3 kilowatts of solar coming in, you can tell your inverter to use 2 kilowatts of your solar to boil the kettle and not discharge and recharge your battery with every single load. And that just reduces the or increases the lifespan of your battery. Are you constantly worried about the power running out? Yeah, to start with you are, but as you've been living with it for a while, you start to get used to the power that you're going to be consuming, you start to get used to the power you're going to be generating, and you start to get a feel for whether days are going to be a good generation day or not. So today's looks like it's overcast. You might think it's bad for solar, but actually today's going to be a quite good solar day. Sometimes when the cloud comes low, you just get a feel for it. So yeah, initially you're going to be a bit worried about power running out, but as you get used to it, you get kind of more used to the electricity you use. It's not a stress anymore. You just get used to it. How often do you check the power level? So when I get up in the morning, after I've had my breakfast, I come out and check the power. It's almost always as I expect it. And then as I pass the inverter every day, I just check it just to see what kind of power levels we've got, mainly because we're generating too much. And if I see that the battery charge is getting quite high, I decide where I'd like that power to be sent to, rather than it automatically dump loading. So I'll go somewhere and turn a heater on or a dehumidifier somewhere just to use the power to heat a storage room that we might want to, or dehumidify somewhere, rather than it automatically dump loading. So I check quite frequently, but you don't have to. Our inverter's got Wi-Fi, so you can check it remotely. So yeah, I do check it a lot, but not because I'm worried, just because I'm around and I pass it anyway. This is the big one, how expensive is it? So £10,000. There you go, nice and easy answer, isn't it? So the inverter, the solar panels, our hydro system, the batteries, maybe the fuses and stuff are included in that, is about 10 grand. So it's not cheap, but it's not too bad either, is it? For all your power, we've got quite a lot of power, £10,000. You might have to make your own mind up whether you think that's a lot or not. We were paying 400 quid a month for your utilities where we were before. However, that includes water and stuff as well. So 10 grand, you might spec yours differently and it costs different amounts. So that's how much it cost us. Is it really free energy? Yes and no. You tell a lot of these answers are like, sort of. So yes, it's completely free. We don't pay anything for our energy. We also don't feed it back in, so we don't get paid for any of our energy, which I'm not even sure if you can sign up for that anymore, but we don't want to sign up for that. So yes, it is completely free. However, if you factor in the replacing the components that you're going to have to do every period of time, then no, it's not like it's a one-off 10 grand expense and then you never touch it again. However, I've done the numbers, and the batteries can last up to 14 years. They're 1,250 quid. I'm going to have to put on screen if I've multiplied that by 2, because they're 1,250 quid each. I'm going to get a calculator and just check that now. Right, so the batteries were, I've written it all down here, I'm just not sure if I multiplied it by the 2 batteries we've got. So 1,250 quid each, times by 2, lifespan of 14 years, so 2,500 divided by 14, 178 quid per year if you were to save up to buy these new batteries. That's what I'm saying. Divide that by the months is for, yeah, no, so I didn't. So it's 15 quid a month. So if you were to save up enough money to replace your batteries over the 14-year period, like how much it costs you per month, that's 15 quid a month for the batteries. Panels last around 25 years. So the solar panels are 25 years lifespan. They're 2 quid, so that puts us at 17 quid a month. The generator, so the thing with hydro is it's a bit difficult. I actually estimated this lifespan as a lot less because it's got bearings and things going in it, and I'm not planning on keeping this forever. However, if you built your own turbine or a bit more experience, I think maybe you would understand the lifespan. It's just a bit more difficult to calculate the lifespan of a hydro turbine. I said it was going to last about 5 years, which I think is going to be a pretty bad lifespan for that. It was £1,000, so that's 16 quid a month. So if you add 17 to 16 quid, it's £33 a month if you were going to save the money that would be needed to replace the items. However, you have to bear in mind that the technology gets better. It's either going to get cheaper, or if you buy the most modern technology, you're going to get a lot more for your money in the future, aren't you? So it's going to cost that much to replace like for like. Hopefully it'll be cheaper in the future because money will, you know, who knows? Who knows? Inflation's messing things up at the minute, isn't it? But there you go. That's how much it costs a month. So no, it's not free, but it sort of is. Right, I'm going to touch a little bit on power generation. I think the video is getting a bit too long for us to go into generating power and how to calculate how much you need to generate from your solar or your hydro or your wind or anything else you've got. But we'll touch on it here. It's just the inverse of what we did initially. So if you've got a 200 watt base power usage and you just want to keep your batteries at the same charge, you just need to generate 200 watts continuously, don't you? Because that's how much you use. So that's quite easy. We know it's not quite that simple because your power fluctuates and solar doesn't generate all of the time. Okay, so if you're using 200 watts over a 24-hour period, it's 4.8 kilowatts that you need to generate to power those devices. Sorry, did I just say that right? 200 watts over a 24-hour period is 4.8 kilowatts. So you need 4.8 kilowatts of power to cover your electricity requirements at 200 watts continuously. However, we've got, let's say, 8 hours of solar a day. You don't, it fluctuates between the year, but let's say 8 hours of good high-level sunlight. You need 600 watts of solar incoming to cover that amount of power. This is why hydro is so good, because hydro works over the night time. If you want to do the same power with hydro, you just need to match the power. So 200 watt hydro, which is, you know, perhaps small to medium sized hydro. We've got 750, 800 watt hydro here. So, you know, that's the kind of basics of it. I'm not going to go into detail because it's a lot more complex than that. We all know that the power fluctuates and we all know that the solar fluctuates. So it doesn't just stay at a continual power, although hydro does a very good job at staying mostly stable at the power that you set it at, unless the water level drops too low. So you just do the inverse for calculating how much power you want to put in. You just see how much you want to generate, calculate that over the day. But yeah, it's not quite that simple, but that's roughly what you need to do. So that's about it. I'm hoping this is a bit of a resource for you for having a look at how much power we use in a day. Like I said, we haven't gone too much into generation. I could probably do a different video on that if you'd like to, although I've probably covered it in some of my other videos, but maybe I could put that together in a couple of weeks so you can see what we're going to do there. In the next video, we are going to perhaps be taking a trip over to the hotel. We'll be showing you the rural internet we've set up for that. Maybe it's the office, maybe it's the workshop. We're still working on those two. We did a podcast with UK Urban Prepper, so I'll put a link in the description and at the top of the screen somewhere if you want to go watch that. It's about 15-20 minutes long. You just have a chat about our off-grid life here. We go into planning a little bit, and I haven't got into that elsewhere, so you might want to, if you are wondering about getting planning, there's a bit about that. So go and check it out. He's a nice guy. We had a nice chat. So there we go. If you'd like to come and see that, come join us. It'd be nice to have you here, and we'll see you in the next one.